18 U.S. Code Section 2385, the advocating for overthrowing of the United States government. A reminder to you that advocating for overthrowing the United States government is extremely illegal and unconstitutional. But fortunately for Democrats, unlike Republicans with their January 6th insurrection, we are not advocating for overthrowing the United States government. Rather, we're advocating for lawfully dissolving the illegitimate victory of Donald Trump. The difference being that the January 6th insurrection was driven by a false belief that the election was stolen when there was no evidence, at least no sufficient evidence, that it was stolen. This means that the attempt was to overthrow the United States government, to forcibly change the election results, and to illegally extend Donald Trump's presidency. While on our side, at least on my channel, if you look at the first pinned video on the courts, it demonstrates through constitutional evidence that there is no provision within our constitution that allows for democracy to subvert constitutional supremacy. Rather, it is forbidden for anything to subvert and to replace the constitutional authority, which is why we have a constitutional duty and obedience to actually restoring this legitimacy, and that involves dissolving the illegitimate victory of someone who already subverted Article 6 supremacy clause through his violation of Article 2, his oath to the Constitution. The mere act of the certification occurring on January 7 instead of the lawful date of January 6 tells us that he did not execute all laws faithfully. He didn't do this, and there's evidence through the January 6 committee report that he was actually very proactive in ensuring that there was a delay in the certification process. This means that there is immediate violations of the Supreme Clause. This isn't just any violations of, say, freedom of speech. This is the constitutional supremacy that he went under. Here in Article 6, Section 2, the Supremacy Clause, it tells us that this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Now, traditionally, under the American jurisdiction, what you would acknowledge from this is that federal law, federal authority supersedes state rights. This is true within a valid constitutional legitimacy. However, within the reality that the branches that are supposed to actually rectify a violation don't, then there comes a domino effect of responses to restore constitutional legitimacy. Well, what legitimacy was broken? The fact that there's nothing that can subvert the Constitution. Not Donald Trump, not the courts, not Congress, not you, not me, not democracy, nothing but the Constitution can change the Constitution. That's under Article 5, the Amendment Clause. Here in Article 6, Section 3, we know that the senators and representatives before mentioned and the members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. So, the state governments have a duty and obedience to the Constitution, not to the president, not to the federal government, but to the Constitution. If that is broken, then the chains that bind the state government to the federal government are broken. And therefore, our duty as American individuals under the Citizens Almanac, which is published by the United States government, is to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, including that which is illegitimately put forward into the presidency role. In this reality, we have to understand what does it mean to overthrow a government. Now, the legal definition of overthrow is the act of removing a government or leader from power by force or violence. However, our side is not advocating for force or violence, but through a lawful dissolution of this victory. Now, you may say, well, the courts have not found him to be guilty of anything. Now, that's the fault of the DOJ for actually dropping the interference charge. However, Federalist 78 by our forefather Alexander Hamilton, so I didn't write this, they teach us that the prior act of a superior ought to be preferred to the subsequent act of an inferior, so the constitutional supremacy will be superior to that of any law or of any type of body, including the executive and subordinate authorities. So laws and regulations will always be subordinate to the actual constitutional social contract. If laws and regulations are contrary to the Constitution, it will always be invalid. And that accordingly, whenever a particular law contravenes the Constitution, it will be the duty of the courts to adhere to the Constitution and disregard the law. But what happens when we don't have any legal remedy because they either refuse to take it up or there's no bodies that will take up the case in order to put it through the courts? Or say the courts just judge contrary to the actual constitutional authority. John Locke, political philosopher who was a great influencer into our actual social contract, says there is one way more whereby such a government may be dissolved, and that is when he who has the supreme executive power, Donald Trump on January 6, neglects and abandons that charge so that the laws already made can no longer be put in execution. That is actually what happened on January 6. This is to reduce all to anarchy and so effectually to dissolve the government, for laws not being made for themselves but to be by their execution the bonds of the society, to keep every part of the body politic in its due place and function. When that totally ceases, the government visibly ceases and the people become a confused multitude without order or connection. And you see, the courts and Congress should exist in order to rectify this damage. However, because of political preference, they refuse to do so. But what does this mean? They think that this means that ambiguity will allow them to get away with it. But John Locke also talks about this. John Locke guides, there can be no pretense for force, which is only to be used where a man is intercepted from appealing to the law. For nothing is to be accounted hostile force, but where it leaves not the remedy of such an appeal, and it is such force alone that puts him that uses it into a state of war and makes it lawful to resist him. See, there's a difference between breaking something like the freedom of speech and the courts not giving us a remedy in that, and Donald Trump breaking the supreme law of Article 6 supremacy clause, right? Because how are you not going to rectify our supreme authority? Rather, John Locke guides, wherever law ends, tyranny begins. And when our supreme law ends, which was on January 6th, and upon allowing for Donald Trump to retake presidency, that means that law ends on January 20th. That's when tyranny begins. Federalist 9 by Alexander Hamilton. If a single member should attempt to violate the supreme authority, that in our current reality is Article 6 Supremacy Clause, he could not be supposed to have an equal authority and credit in all the states. Should a popular insurrection happen in one of the states, the others are able to quell it. Well, we didn't because the Senate refused to impeach him, didn't they? They found a legal technicality and were like, no thanks. He was acquitted. Should abuses creep into one part, they're reformed by those that remain sound. The country may be destroyed on one side and not on the other. The country may be dissolved and the states preserve their sovereignty. What did John Locke say? Wherever law ends, tyranny begins. What do you think will happen on January 20? Which means it is critical that his win is lawfully dissolved. It is urgent that this victory be lawfully dissolved, whether that is through foreign interference or otherwise. If there is evidence, it is important because there is a constitutional legitimacy issue, and if that is not solved, then that means that we transition into constitutional crisis, which involves a political vacuum, which means that the laws and regulations that exist are virtually recommendations, right?